this is a topic that I like talking about very much. It's a funny thing. You meet people, of course, in your life who have an inordinate fondness for some particular subject area. There was actually a delightful book written a few years ago called an Inordinate Fondness for Beetles. I once met a fellow who told me very proudly he had the third largest collection in the world of college logo golf balls. I've met people who are passionate about strange things that I've never heard of. And of course, people who are in parliamentary procedure are in an interesting area that they have an inordinate fondness for this topic of parliamentary law, parliamentary procedure that many people are unfamiliar with, but more people should be. And I'm going to talk about that today. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about parliamentary procedure from the perspective of the grand book, which you can see behind me, of Robert's Rules of Order. I think I got them in there backwards, actually. Just so you know, if you actually buy the book, the titles are the right way. I think they're backwards on the image behind me. I became involved in this subject quite a few years ago. It actually happened in, I think, 2006. I had been invited to give a talk on parliamentary procedure at a parliamentary seminar that took place in Baltimore, which was organized by some of the people whose names are familiar to you from the cover of the book: Henry Martin Robert III, Daniel H. Honeyman, and Thomas Balch, as we know him, Burke Balch. They invited me to give a talk there. And a couple of weeks later, I received a concise and elegantly written letter from Mr. Honeyman asking me whether I might be interested in having a continuing association, as he put it, with the writing of the book. And if so, would I be so good as to present myself at the law offices of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston in Baltimore on a particular date for an interview? And I drove down from New York, where I live, down to Baltimore, and I interviewed with those three men. And then we went out to lunch together. And then they wrote back a couple weeks later and said, you know, we'd really like you to join the authorship team for Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. And then it took about a year and a half before I was added to the team, because I had to be placed under contract to the Robert's Rules Association. And let me tell you, that group didn't move very quickly. But since that time, it was actually in early 2008 that I was placed under contract. And for now 15 years, I've been a member of that authorship team. And it's given me, I would say, a very nearly unique perspective on the book. And so what I wanted to do today is to sort of talk about what the book is from the perspective of different groups of people. We'll talk about it from the perspective of the ordinary user who encounters it in the bookstore, is maybe seeking out help because they're having difficulty in a meeting. The perspective of the Robert family, to whom it is a great legacy, and the perspective of the authorship team that has responsibility for periodically updating the book. Let's see, here are some slightly nicer pictures of the book in the current 12th edition, which was published in 2020. The next edition will come out likely in 2030. Before we dive into the talk, I wanted to ask you a few questions just as kind of warm-ups to get you thinking about the history, the legacy of Robert's Rules of Order, and also about the content of the book itself. It doesn't matter how familiar you are with any of this. These are just fun questions. You won't be graded on them. And if you want to take a note to write down your thoughts, we'll cross-check at the end of the time what the answers are. So the first question I wanted to ask you to think about is about the family of the original author of Robert's Rules. The book was written by Henry Martin Robert I. The question is, what was the greatest fear of Adeline Lawton Robert, the mother of Henry Martin Robert I, during the American Civil War? There was one specific concern that consumed her at that time. The second question is a true or false question. So you've got a 50-50 chance on this one. Flip a coin if you don't know. Henry Martin Robert I served as commanding officer of the United States Army Corps of Engineers for only 1 month. Now, some of you may be aware that Henry Martin Robert I was a very famous engineer. Okay, so the last 3 warm-up questions are all going to relate to parliamentary procedure. And I'm going to pose certain scenarios, certain circumstances that you might encounter in a meeting. So for the third question, the bylaws of the Briarcliff Theosophical Society state that election of officers is to be conducted by ballot vote. So the words ballot vote appear in the bylaws. To speed the counting of votes that will be cast by its 400 members at the annual meeting, the Society has purchased electronic handheld keypads. If there is no time to amend the bylaws before voting, will it still be possible to vote by keypad? And if so, how? So the bylaws specify ballot voting as the only allowable method for the election of officers, but they would like to do it using these electronic keypads because I don't know if you've ever been through this with an organization, counting 400 ballots takes a long time. It's especially bad if you have to reballot. So the question is, can they do that even though they don't have time to amend those bylaws? The fourth question, the special committee that was appointed to plan the annual member luncheon has not been able to meet. The time for making its recommendation is approaching. To expedite the committee's work, a member moves that the committee be instructed to meet by Zoom. Is this motion in order? And if so, what vote is required to adopt it? This is a fairly common kind of problem where you refer something to a committee. You appoint a committee to do some work for you, and they don't come back very quickly with the information. So you want to move it forward. You're thinking they're having troubles getting together in meetings. So you think, well, why can't they just meet by Zoom the way you and I are meeting right now? Is a motion to instruct them to meet by Zoom in order? And what vote, a majority, 2/3, what vote would be necessary to do that? The fifth and final warm-up question is the following. At a membership meeting, the Assembly defeats a motion that the Society endorse Senator Throckmorton for re-election. The following week, the Executive Board adopts that same motion that the Society endorse Senator Throckmorton for re-election. Is the board's action proper? And if not, what action can the membership take in response? Now, I don't know if you've encountered this problem precisely, but I suspect many of you have encountered the issue where you have conflicts between what seems to be the will of the membership, as expressed by what it has or hasn't done in a meeting, and the will of the board. So this is a question where we're asking whether the board is permitted to adopt a motion that was previously rejected by the Assembly, and if not, what the Assembly can do about the membership. Okay, that's it. Those are my questions, and hopefully we'll run across the answers along the way as we work our way through this. And you can stop me, as I say, anytime if you have questions, but you can't stop me to ask those questions until we get to them, okay? They'll come up when they come up, all right? Okay, so as I say, yeah.
How would you like people to put questions in the chat and I'll alert you? Do you want hand raises? Do you want just loud shout outs? Take your choice.
You guys, however you like doing it is fine with me. What do you think? Do you want to, how about people put something in the chat and then you can alert me? And then we can, and if we want to have a back and forth and they want to speak, that's fine as well. But that way, because I know I'm not going to be checking the chat.
Okay. Do you see a hand raise if I do that?
I sure do. Yep.
Okay. So if somebody puts a question in the chat, I'll raise my paw.
Gotcha. completely understand.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, we're going to talk about Robert's Rules of Order, the big book, several different perspectives. From the perspective of a user, what is it? It is the most widely used parliamentary authority in America. And I guess the question is, what does that even really mean? A parliamentary authority, of course, is a book containing procedural rules for groups that meet and make decisions. And in order to really understand the purpose of the book, we have to understand the kinds of organizations that it's intended to apply to. And I make a big point of this, that there are many ways of making decisions other than what we call a deliberative assembly, for which the book applies. A deliberative assembly is basically distinguished by having the following 6 characteristics. So these are the characteristics of the organizations that are intended to use this particular book. First off, a deliberative assembly is a group that meets to discuss and decide actions to be taken in the name of the organization. Secondly, the group meets in such a way that everyone can hear one another. Thirdly, members are free to act according to their own judgment. Fourth, each member who is present has an equal vote in the matter. Fifth, you can disagree with the decision without quitting the group. And sixth, those who attend a meeting act for the entire membership. Now, I think those 6 are much more meaningful if you think of counterexamples, because there are lots of situations where we make decisions and we don't follow a pattern, anything like that. When we decide who's going to be president of the United States, we don't all, 100 million voters, meet in one place to debate, to discuss the matter in order to make that decision. It's a completely different model where the voting takes place essentially without a meeting. When we have conversations by email that go back and forth trying to make a certain decision, we're not meeting at one time in such a way that everyone can hear one another. When we walk into a business meeting, we may be representing some particular constituency or representing the views of our boss or employer and not acting according to our own judgment. Some of you may have familiarity with condominium associations. Condo associations frequently don't have this provision that each member who is present has an equal vote. And the reason is that if Penelope's condo is worth 3 times much money as mine, she gets 3 times as many votes as I do. It's like a shareholders organization where it's not the member who votes, but the stock that votes. It's important to distinguish this type of organization from other decision-making bodies. These are the deliberative assemblies that we're actually aiming the book towards. And the book deals with the basic rights of the members of those organizations, their right to attend meetings, their right to make motions, their right to speak and debate, their right to vote. And there are lots of deliberative assemblies that you've been members of yourself or have served: church groups, county commissions, and legislatures. State legislatures do not use Robert's Rules of Order newly revised. However, there are lots of legislative bodies and quasi-legislative bodies that do. School boards, for example, water boards, library boards, county legislatures, town councils, homeowners associations, nonprofit associations, professional societies, school boards, trade unions. Then there are other organizations that I mentioned, like the shareholders of a stock corporation. They don't quite meet all of these requirements because maybe some people have more votes than others. But nevertheless, the rules of parliamentary procedure may apply to them anyway, with certain modifications. Okay, so the big question is, what do these people need? I mean, it's a big book. I'm almost embarrassed by how big it is. I mean, it's over 600 pages. There's a lot in it. Well, what's it? What do you need if you're going to conduct meetings? What are you looking to the book for? I mean, I think you want rules on each motion. the motion for the previous question, which closes debate, the motion to postpone or to refer or to amend, the point of order, the motion to appeal, to rescind a previous decision. You need to know when that motion is going to be in order, whether it can be debated or amended, what vote is needed to adopt it. Since you're building an organization, you're going to need officers. And different organizations have different officers, but most organizations have at least a president, a vice president, and secretary. And if there's any money at all, they'll have a treasurer. So what are the duties of those officers? They need a record of the business that they transact. So what's the correct form of minutes and how to prove them? What's the proper conduct of subordinate bodies? Typically, an assembly can't make all the decisions on its own. So it will refer matters to a subordinate body for investigation and sometimes for action. What is the proper conduct of a board or a committee? If it's a national organization that has many constituent chapters, they may get together to hold conventions. Conventions are quite complex. What are the rules for managing conventions? And of course, you need to have rules about rules. The key organic rules of an organization are its bylaws. So you need to deal with how to draft and amend bylaws. So I guess the question is, how exactly do you go about using this 600-page book? I mean, there are lots of good answers. I mean, one is it's pretty thick. If you just set it with an audible thunk on the lectern when you get up to preside, it may cow people into submission. And if that doesn't work, you might just take it in your hand and whack someone on the side of the head with it. Perhaps a gentler way of using it is by, quote, adopting. And to adopt it, typically you would place a provision in the bylaws. It doesn't really have to be in the bylaws, but it probably should be. That says the rules contained in the current edition of Robert's Rules of Order newly revised shall govern the society in all cases to which they are applicable, and in which they are not inconsistent with these bylaws and any special rules of order the society may adopt. Okay, there's a lot packed into that. It's a standard language. If you Google those words, you'll find them all over the internet because lots of bylaws contain them. You'll notice that I put some of the words in red boldface. I must want to draw your attention to them. The current edition, by adopting the book in the form of saying the current edition of Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, you're committing not only to the 12th edition, which is the current edition, but on the day that the 13th edition is published, you're committing to that as well. And so there's good and bad in this. I would say there's only good. Some people think there's bad in it. The good part is I've actually run across organizations that neglect to put that in. And they will say something like the rules contained in the 4th edition of Robert's Rules of Order shall govern the society, yada, yada, yada. Well, the 4th edition was published in the 1920s. And 100 years ago, someone put that provision in their bylaws and no one thought to change it. And I've actually known parliamentarians who have been involved in legal cases where they had to give legal opinions, well, not legal opinions, I should say parliamentary opinions, but submitted in law cases and submitted in testimony about a book that's 100 years old, because that's the way the bylaws were written. On the other hand, I can tell you, and I know some of you are members of NAP, maybe all of you are members of the National Association of Parliamentarians, but back in 2011, when the 11th edition of Robert's Rules of Order newly revised was published, there was a bit of a glitch. The timing of the 11th edition coincided with a year in which the National Association of Parliamentarians was holding one of its conventions. Now, the NAP, as it's called, holds a convention every other year. They had one this year. In the off years, they have what they call training conference. Now, if a new edition of Robert's Rules of Order newly revised comes out with a training conference, everyone's very happy. They say, oh, good, let's get some members of the authorship team in to train us about this new book. But this came out the year of the convention when they were conducting large amounts of business. And I got to tell you, These people went mad. They went crazy. They said, we're going to have a convention tomorrow and you're going to have the book published in September of this year. And we don't even know what's in the book. And we don't even know what rules are going to be in place when we meet tomorrow. There was actually a lot of concern about that, which I thought was hilarious. Because although a big part of this particular talk is about the fact that it's an evolving record of parliamentary procedure and changes are made, like, come on, guys, what kind of changes did you think we were going to make? You know, it's no longer a majority vote; it's a 9/10 vote. You know, you're no longer allowed to postpone anything. I mean, you know, really, I mean, we put a lot of work into changing one edition from the last, but you know, they don't change that much. But at any rate, this is the standard language that we put in. A big problem that comes up is when you're dealing with novice organizations, novice parliamentarians, they're not that familiar with it. They say, well, what if we adopt this great big 600-page book and we find out that there's something in it we don't like? Well, you can adopt a so-called custom rule that would either supplement or modify the existing rules in the book. Or you can suspend a rule that you don't like, and normally that can be done by 2/3 vote. I'm going to pause here because I realized perhaps everyone here is already familiar with it. When I'm talking to people very frequently, I'm dealing with people who have no background in parliamentary procedure. I don't know if there's anyone in the room who doesn't know what I mean when I say RONR. And there's a little bit of a story associated with that. But in fact, the book that we're talking about, the book that I'm talking about, Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised, has been referred to as RONR, that is Rules of Order Newly Revised, by the Robert family for many, many years. It's an old Robert family abbreviation. What actually happened, and we'll get more into this in a little while, when the General Robert was preparing what he called Robert's Rules of Order Revised, which was a new version of the old Robert's Rules of Order. He took to referring to the Rules of Order as RO and the Rules of Order Revised as ROR. So they followed that tradition and made Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised RONR. And I don't know, I guess maybe in 2070, my grandchildren will help to write Robert's Rules of Order even more newly revised, and they'll change the letters a little bit. I want to say just a little bit more. Again, I'm talking about how the book is perceived by that novice who walks into the bookstore and picks it up because they've just come out of the worst PTA meeting of their life, and they're trying to encounter this book for the first time. You may be such a novice, you may meet such a novice and advise them. How do you even make sense of a book of this size? I mean, a book that's geared towards deliberative assemblies that has all these different rules. If you flip through the table of contents, I think in some sense, you can see that it naturally fits into 4 big chunks. The first of these chunks, chapters 1 through 4, is an overview of the deliberative process. And obviously, that's the first part of the book you should read if you're just trying to get a handle on generally how a meeting works. Then the remaining chapters fit into 3 different focuses that I think can be read in any order or picked at as needed. The first of these, chapters 5 through 10, deal with motions that are moved in a meeting. The second, chapters 11 through 14, deal with the conduct of meetings apart from the moving and adoption of motions. And the last chapters, 15 through 20, really deal with organizational issues. So digging into those a little bit more deeply. When you talk about an overview of the deliberative process, chapter 1 deals with what we were talking about, the various types of deliberative assemblies. Then chapter 2 moves on to the conduct of business. Chapter 3 describes motions in kind of generality, and chapter 4 describes meetings in generality. When we get into the what I call the focus areas, chapters 5 through 10 are, I associate these, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, there are young people who will compete in parliamentary contests. I know some people who advise and train these groups of people. Sometimes it's done through organizations like what is called the Business Professionals of America or something like that. There are these professional organizations that have student chapters, and then the students compete on parliamentary procedure by creating mock meetings. And what people think about when they think of parliamentary procedure is mostly what's in these chapters. It's when am I allowed to make this motion? Does this motion need a second? Can I debate the motion, or is it undebatable? What vote is needed to adopt the motion? It's these kinds of issues that they illustrate in these sort of mock meetings in their competitions. The second focus area on meetings deals with these more general issues that come up in meetings. Quorum, how many people do we need to have present at a meeting in order to conduct business legally? Order of business and related concepts, agendas. What order do we take business up in? How do we assign the floor? Who gets to speak when two people both want to speak? How do we choose who goes first? How do we conduct debate? How do we vote? How are nominations and elections handled? Probably the deepest part of the book is the last part that really steps outside of the meeting itself and talks about how organizations come into being and how they're managed. We need officers, so what are their duties? One of the principal duties of the secretary is to prepare minutes. How does the secretary do that? How do boards and committees function? We get into special types of meetings, mass meetings. How do you organize a permanent society? Before there was a Toastmasters, someone had to create a Toastmasters. How did they create? How do you set up a series of meetings and draft the bylaws to create an organization? How do you amend bylaws? How do you conduct conventions? And the last one, of course, is disciplinary proceedings. How do you conduct disciplinary proceedings, a trial, for example, a motion of censure, when you want to take action against a member? A couple of just more quick things I just want to mention about it, since this is still fairly new. I mean, I guess we're now 3 years into the life of this particular edition. Probably the biggest change that was made in the publication of Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised with the 13th edition was the creation of these paragraph numbers. It's completely non-substantive, but it's something that people have enjoyed very much. So again, the question, if you're just an ordinary user coming to the book as a parliamentary authority, how do you use it? Well, an important part of it are these paragraph numbers. To the left of each page, there are numbers, 56:20, 56:21. It's like chapter and verse in the Bible. The first number represents the chapter of the book, and the second number represents the paragraph. And these are used for cross-references. So for example, if you look at the middle of this quoted page, this is from the 12th edition here, you see the 56:21, it says in parentheses C4742. So that's a cross-reference to chapter 47, paragraph 42 within that paragraph. So there's a lot of cross-referencing inside of this book to help you with it. And a final hint on how to go about using Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised is to pick up a copy of Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised in brief. That is a crazy long title. Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised in brief. I think that's 8 words long. It's a very long title. It's much shorter than RO&R. It contains paragraph references back to RO&R. It's not a parliamentary authority by itself because it doesn't claim to be a complete set of rules on parliamentary procedure. It's just a kind of like a footstool to help you step up to the full-fledged RO&R. Okay, so I want to move on. That first part, of course, is just a very general kind of overview of what the book is. But now I want to kind of pull back the curtains a little bit and talk about the things that are maybe a bit more distinctive from the perspective of the family. And then we'll go on to the authorship team. So, behind what that person who, after a bad PTA meeting, walks into Barnes and Nobles and goes looking for this book, or maybe no one does that anymore. They order it off of Amazon, I suppose. Beyond that, what is the book to the people who make sure that it continues to exist, who work on writing it, who work to continue the legacy? For the Robert family, this book is a legacy a kind of inheritance of their ancestor, General Henry Martin Robert, who was the initial author. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about his life and how the family has worked for a century now to keep that legacy alive. This is the man. This is a really nice photo of him. I only came across this photo fairly recently when it was shown to me by some members of the Robert family. I love this photo of him. Henry Martin Robert, the things that I think most people know, I think a lot of people you've heard the term General Robert. He was indeed a brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He was, in fact, the commanding officer of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We'll talk about how long that lasted in a bit. He was the architect of the Galveston seawall. There was a great flood in Galveston, Texas, and he was responsible after his time in the Army with serving as the leader of the Board of Engineers that designed the Galveston seawall that would prevent that. That seawall is still standing now after more than 100 years. It is still in good shape, I'm told. He is also obviously the author of Robert's Rule of Order. Digging back a little bit more into his history, though, I have a few different sources. I mean, there's some information in the introduction to RONR, and I've read some articles about him, but I think my favorite source of information about Henry Martin Robert I is Henry Martin Robert III, who was his grandson. It was a great privilege of mine to work alongside Henry Martin Robert III for a number of years on the authorship of the 11th and 12th editions. It may sort of seem surprising given that General Robert was born in 1837, but his grandson was still alive until just a few years ago. His grandson, Henry, our Henry as we call him, lived to be nearly 100 years old. So I learned a lot about Henry's grandfather just over the course of dinners and casual conversation with him. General Robert was a son of the South. He was born, if you can believe it, in Robertville, South Carolina, a town that was named for his family, which had been eminent in the area since colonial times. It's sort of a dark note in this talk, but I do have to address it. This was a slaveholding family. General Robert's grandfather had a very large plantation that had, I think, a couple hundred slaves. A number of General Robert's uncles owned plantations with slaves. When Henry Martin Robert I was quite young, I think maybe 11 or 12 years old, his father, the Reverend Joseph T. Robert, had a crisis of conscience on the matter of slavery. He felt that it was an odious thing. And so he made the decision to sell his plantation at a loss and to free his slaves and to move his family out of the South, turning his back on that legacy and moving into the North. They moved to Ohio. And he struggled a bit to support his family, both as a minister and educator for a number of years. What the Reverend Joseph T. Robert is probably best known for, other than being the father of General Robert, is that he was the first president of the institution which would one day be called Morehouse College, an historically Black college in the South. So Henry Martin Robert the first again went to West Point when he was a young man to be educated. He studied engineering at West Point. And of course, while he was at West Point, war broke out. The Civil War broke out. Now, this is a very strange thing. I mean, I never really thought about it until our Henry told me the story, because you can imagine what's going on here. This is West Point. This is the Army Academy for the entire country. So obviously you have young men from the South and from the North. Now the country is going to war with itself. So what happens? Well, apparently it was a very orderly thing. It was understood by those who led West Point that the young men who came from the South would undoubtedly return to the South and fight for the Confederacy. And so a stack of papers was prepared, and as they came in, they were handed these papers so that they could resign their commissions in the Union and go to the South. Henry Martin Robert had spent a sleepless night, pacing the floor of his room, trying to decide what he should do. And though he was a son of the South, he ultimately came to the conclusion that while his allegiances truly did lay with the South, he felt that the best way he could serve the interests of the South was to join the Union Army, to fight against the Confederacy, and to work towards the abolition of slavery. And so when he was presented with his paper to resign his commission, he declined it. He stayed in the Army. And the very great fear of his mother, Adeline, was that her own son would meet one of her brothers on the battlefield. I believe the number sticks in my head. I don't have it written down anywhere, that he had 14 uncles who served in the Confederate Army, including one who was the quartermaster general for the Confederate Army. As it turns out, Henry Robert did not meet any of his relatives on the battlefield. He didn't see any battlefields. He was stationed in Washington and worked on the defense of that particular city through the war. And then he went on into a storied career in the U.S. Army, in the Army Corps of Engineers. His involvement in parliamentary procedure is quite famous, the origin of that. As it's told in the introduction to RONR, he was asked without warning to preside over a public meeting that was being held in a church. This was about the defense of the town. And he didn't know what he was doing. And if you've ever been in a badly run meeting, you know how frustrating it is. Well, when you're in a badly run meeting and you're the one who's running it, it's a bit more than just frustrating. It's terrifying and it's deeply embarrassing. And he made a decision that he would never again attend a meeting without knowing something about parliamentary law. So he began studying the few books on the subject, but he quickly discovered that different authorities had different ideas of how meetings should be run. And that what was happening is that people around the country were conducting meetings according to the rules established in their own state legislatures, and so that there was no national parliamentary procedure. And he worked to create one. And that was the genesis of his book, Robert's Rules of Order, in its first edition, this national set of rules. I want to, before we move on, just sort of briefly address the aftermath. After he had written his book, after he had revised it, after he had worked on, he did eventually become, as I've mentioned, the commanding officer of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. If you thought that he held that position for merely 1 month, I'm afraid you were way off. He held it for 1 day. According to our Henry, what happened was his grandfather, as the most senior member of the Army Corps of Engineers, should have been put into the command of that corps, but was passed over for political reasons. And so 1 day before General Robert was to have been forcibly resigned due to his age, the man who was the commanding officer of the Army Corps, who was a close friend of his, retired so that General Robert could be elevated to that position for 1 day and hold it for 1 day. So that's how he got into that position, but it was very, very brief. I've talked a lot about General Robert. I haven't talked much about the rest of the family. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that this is really a legacy the family takes very, very seriously. So I want to try to show what's happened over the years. That first edition that he wrote after he had completed his study of parliamentary procedure was published in 1876. And it sold out so rapidly that he published a new edition later the same year. Then some years went by, and in 1893, he published a third edition. And that was the end of the book that we commonly call today Robert's Rules of Order. When he came back to this in 1950, he retitled it Robert's Rules of Order Revised. And it was significantly expanded. In 1923, he died, and his expectation had been that his son, Henry Martin Robert II, would take over the family business, as it were. Henry Martin Robert II was a professor at the Naval Academy. However, he died rather young in 1937, which was a great blow to the family. And in fact, what ended up happening is that a 5th and 6th editions, also under the title Robert's Rules of Order Revised, were published. And the work was done by his General Robert's second wife, Isabel, and his daughter-in-law. This was the widow of Henry Martin Robert II, Sarah Corbin Robert, who was the preeminent parliamentarian of her generation. In 1957, Isabel Robert died. Sarah Corbin Robert took over, and in 1970, she organized the writing of a very, very substantial expansion of the book into Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised. This was the 7th edition. And in this work, she was joined by an attorney from Baltimore named Bill Evans, by an academic, Cleary, and by her own son, Henry Robert III. She died in 1972. So this gives you a picture of what's happened since that time. Now, I want to stress that all members of the authorship team, myself included, serve under contract to something called the Robert's Rules Association, which is an association of the descendants of Henry Martin Robert I. General Robert had 4 children, a son, who I've mentioned, and 3 daughters. And his living descendants are members of this association, and they have a pecuniary interest in the book. They receive royalties. But more than that, they have just a personal interest in maintaining the legacy of the book. And so they've worked to hire people who would continue the task of periodically revising the book. In addition to those I've mentioned, there is Daniel H. Hunneman, another lawyer who was a friend of Bill Evans from Baltimore, Thomas Burke Balch, an attorney who resides in Virginia. And then they really, really lowered the bar and brought in a couple of jerks named Seabold and Gerber, and we did our best not to get in anyone's way. And then the 12th edition in 2020 is the most recent. Bill Evans is no longer alive, and neither, as I've noted there, is Henry Robert III. So there are 4 living members. I really cannot begin to say enough about this amazing family. This gentleman right here is Martin Redgrave. Martin Redgrave, member of the Redgrave branch of the Robert family, is a great-great-grandson of General Robert. Our Henry Robert III was a first cousin of Martin Redgrave's grandfather. And I've met Martin on a number of occasions, and his brother Tim and his sister Barbara and other members in other branches of the family. These are such an impressive group of people. They are all they're like captains of industry, all of them. They're all really tall. They're all really athletic and good looking and confident. I mean, when I'm around the Redgraves, I have to avert my gaze a little bit due to the blinding gleam of their straight white teeth. I mean, they're just really impressive people. And they have such a passion for this book that it's almost shaming if you don't share that passion. I mean, they are not, any of them that I've dealt with, parliamentarians. There are a couple of members of the organization, however, who have gotten involved in parliamentary procedure. There's one descendant who recently got her professional registered parliamentarian credential, I believe, from the NAP. But they have a great passion for this as a legacy. And we who are involved in the authorship team really serve them and their interest to maintain the quality of the book and its standing in the parliamentary community. So when you look back at that, it's 150 years almost since the first edition, and throughout that entire time, the Robert family has been involved in it. Every person who has ever participated in the authoring of any edition of the book has either been a member of the Robert family or has worked with a member of the Robert family. And it's still the Robert family in control of all the decisions today. I want to move into the third and final segment here by talking about the book from the perspective of the authorship team in terms of what we're trying to do when we are looking at an edition. What were we trying to do when we published the 11th edition in 2011 or the 12th edition in 2020? What's going on? I think the best way I can introduce this is to show you a particular parliamentary problem, a sort of conundrum, which has been kicking around for the last 100 years. There's General Robert again. Back in the day when people rode in horse and buggies and wrote with feathered quills, he got the following question written to him. He got many questions written to him. The question is, may a member of a society hold more than one office at a time? Okay, can you be both the president and the treasurer of your society at the same time? It's a fair question. Here is his response. He says, yes, unless limited by the bylaws. I mean, of course, if the bylaws say you can't. Then he goes on, he says, in most societies, it is generally understood that no member is to hold two offices, such as president and treasurer. Hence, if a member is elected to two offices and he is present, he should choose the one he accepts. If he is absent, the society should determine by vote which office is assigned to him and then proceed to fill the other office. Is that clear enough? I don't think it's clear at all. I think that is the most confusing response. The first sentence says, yeah, sure, you can hold two offices. And the rest of it is all about, like, heck no, you can't hold two offices. You have to choose which one you accept, and then we'll vote to fill the other. What does he mean by that? So throughout his lifetime, he was receiving these questions and he was writing answers, but not all of his answers ever really got incorporated in the book to the extent that you would like. And in some cases, the way they were incorporated is a little bit unclear. So there's sort of this ongoing process of interpretation, of trying to understand what's going on. We sat down with this because there was some confusing language in the section on elections in regard to this matter. And we kind of scratched our heads and read between the lines and tried to figure out what he was talking about. Well, and we think we came up with an answer. So I'll try it out on you. If I got it wrong, it doesn't matter. It's in the book now, so it's done. But let's see if we got this right. You've probably been in meetings where you've conducted elections of officers. Very standard for those elections to be conducted by ballot vote. So you had a piece of paper and you checked off names or you wrote names on and handed them in. Well, there are basically two ways of conducting that sort of a vote. One way, which is a very good way but time consuming, we'll call it the slow way, is you take nominations for the president. Then you vote to see which person will be president. Then you take nominations for vice president. Then you vote to see who will be vice president. Then you take nominations and hold an election for secretary, and then you do it for treasurer. The fast way is you take nominations for all four offices at once. You write all their names down on a pre-printed ballot, and then you conduct all the votes at once. Okay, everybody, here are all the nominees, and there's space for write-ins. Just put down your choice for president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and hand in your ballot, count them. Now, why do I say the slow way is better than the fast? Great thing about the slow way is you can take the result of one election into account when you hold nominations and vote for the next office. So why is that an issue? Penelope asked me to give this talk. Penelope's great, right? Penelope's terrific. And so we'd love her to be president. And if she's not going to be president, well, then we'd certainly like her to be vice president. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to nominate her for president and vice president. Okay, so, or maybe I'll be consistent with the example on the screen. President and treasurer. We nominate her for president and treasurer. She doesn't get to be president, at least she'll be treasurer, she'll be on the board. Then we vote all at once, and we don't know whether she's going to be elected president when we're casting our vote for treasurer because we're doing it all at once. And we vote for her for both, and all of a sudden, Penelope is voted president and treasurer. Well, as General Roberts says, it's not that that's not permissible. What it is you probably didn't mean to do that. That probably wasn't your intent. So if that's what happened, then she should go ahead and choose which of those two offices she accepts, and then you should reballot for the other office. And if you really want to have her be your president and your treasurer, you can vote her in. But you have to do it intentionally. Okay, so this is the way that now reads in the 12th edition. When voting for multiple offices by a single ballot, the members are not able to take the result for one office into account when voting for another office. For this reason, a candidate is never deemed elected to more than one office by a single ballot, unless the motion or rules governing the election specifically provide for such simultaneously election. Okay, so we voted her in by a single ballot to two offices, but she's not deemed elected to both. What happens? A candidate who receives a majority for more than one office on a single ballot must, if present, choose which one of the offices he will accept. If he is absent, the assembly decides by a ballot vote the office to be assigned to him. This question, which is debatable, requires a majority vote for adoption. The assembly then ballots again to fill the other offices. The assembly is free, however, to elect the same person to another office on a subsequent ballot unless the bylaws prohibit a person from holding both offices simultaneously. Okay, there's a lot there. One more time. We conducted the election for all four offices, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, in one ballot. We elected Penelope to be both president and treasurer. We probably didn't intend for her to hold both. So if she's present, she gets to pick which one she accepts. If not, we'll decide for her by a ballot vote. Let's suppose that she picks president. We now have another vote on treasurer. And if we really, really want to elect her treasurer as well, we can. Knowing now that she's president, we can make that decision. But there's a good chance we end up electing someone else. Okay. That's a question that came in to General Robert 100 years ago, and the current edition now makes clear what we think his response meant. Now notice, again, I've got some boldface, red, underlined words that I'm drawing your attention to. Why? Everything that I've just described to you was put into the 11th edition back in 2011, except it didn't say anything about how the assembly decides which office to assign to this person. So for the 12th edition, we further elaborated on this by saying, actually, the decision is made by a ballot vote, and the question is debatable, requires a majority vote. So we're still sort of teasing out implications here. So that's the process, is you start with what you think is an okay set of rules. Someone asks the question, you go, I wonder. You offer an opinion on what it can be, and gradually that makes its way into the book, creating a more complete set of rules. Sometimes the question relates to some clever little situation that you haven't thought about before. Other times, the question relates to some sort of new technology or an evolving practice within parliamentary procedure that you have to take into account. These questions come from all sorts of places, some from private communications. I get email from people saying, hey, I've got a question. What do you think about this? Some come from the Roberts Rules of Order newly revised online forum, which is maintained by the Roberts Rules Association. And you, if you've never done it, it's a real treat. You can go on there. There's a general forum, an advanced forum. You can ask any question you like. And there's some really sharp parliamentarians there who will help answer it. And if it's a question no one knows the answer to, it just might find its way into the 13th edition. Also through consulting practices, members of the authorship team who get hired to do parliamentary consulting sometimes run across problems in their practice that cause us to initiate changes in the book. and some ideas just come on our own by close reading of the book. So when I sort of teased out in my abstract ways that you can improve the next edition, again, the 13th edition will be published in 2030. If you have ideas, if you have questions, you can email them. And by bringing those concerns to our attention, you can help us to create a more fully developed parliamentary law. Where do we get the answers for these questions? A lot of times the answer to a question that arises in one part of the book is really in another part of the book. It's just something that something's incomplete in one particular section, but there's a more complete statement elsewhere. We can deal with it just by maybe making a cross-reference. Other times we have to do some real research. We have to go back into General Roberts' magnum opus written in the 1920s, Parliamentary Law, and the earlier editions of Robert's Rules. There have been a couple of occasions where we've looked into the practices of the United States House of Representatives. Obviously, the practices of a national legislature are quite different from the practices of a PTA, but nevertheless, the rules of the House are sometimes helpful in trying to figure out how certain things should be handled. Okay, I want to go through a few just scenarios. These will relate to those last three warm-up questions that I gave you. And I'm going to talk about some changes that have been made in the book. I picked out some scenarios that I think are kind of broadly applicable. I mean, frankly, sometimes the work is sort of esoteric, but I think these are all pretty accessible changes that had to be made. For the first one, which is on ballot voting, I just want to sort of set the ground rules here. There are lots of ways that people conduct voting that you're familiar with. A voice vote, those in favor will say aye. Show of hands, those in favor raise the right hand. Rising vote, those in favor will rise. You can have people rise and remain standing in place until they're counted. You can have a roll call vote where you will read off the names of the members of the society. And of course, you can have a ballot vote. So traditional ballot voting, and this is what appears in the 11th edition, is voting by ballot, slips of paper on which the voter marks his vote, that is used when secrecy of the members' votes is desired. So what does a ballot look like? It can be a blank piece of paper on which you simply write down the name of your preferred candidate, or yes or no if it's a yes-no vote. Or ballots are often pre-printed with the names of nominees, but you always allow an opportunity for someone to write in the name of an unnominated candidate. Okay, so ballots are pieces of paper. Actually, there's something interesting here. I don't know if you know that the word ballot comes from the Italian, and it doesn't mean piece of paper. It actually refers to a small stone. If you're familiar with the concept of blackballing, where for a membership to a society, each member would be given either a white ball or a white ball and a black ball, and then they would vote on the admission of a new member. And they could drop white or black into a box, a ballot box. And if you didn't want someone to come in, you would drop the black ball. And that's the meaning of the term black ball. So it's not really clear that ballot voting has to be on paper. It's just sort of the way we do it. The key characteristic of ballot voting is that it's secret. So no one knows whether you voted yes or no, or in an election, which candidate you voted for when you do a proper ballot vote. And no one knows whether you voted for a nominee or a write-in candidate. And no one knows whether you actually voted or you abstained, right? I mean, someone gives you a piece of paper, you pretend to write something on it, you fold it up, you put it into the ballot box. Well, maybe you didn't even vote. That's the secrecy. And that's what's being protected, your right to make a secret vote when we adopt a rule that requires a ballot vote. If the bylaws require that a vote be taken by ballot, this rule may not be suspended. Okay, so here was the scenario I asked you about. The bylaws of the Briarcliff Theosophical Society state that the election of officers is to be conducted by ballot vote to speed the counting of the votes that will be cast by its 400 members at the meeting. The society has purchased these electronic handheld keypads. I imagine you've seen these keypads. They're very common in meetings. They look like a TV remote. They've got buttons on them. You press 1 for yes, 2 for no, or if there are candidates, they might have numbers associated with it. If there's no time to amend the bylaws before voting, will it still be possible to vote by keypad, and if so, how? Well, I promise you, General Robert, in all of his writings, said nothing about electronic keypads. But he did say a lot about the core idea behind ballot voting, namely that its purpose is to provide a secret form of voting. And so the current edition, the 12th edition, now says, oh, and by the way, all of these references are the 12th edition unless they say otherwise. So in paragraph 4518, a ballot vote is a vote taken by instruments such as slips of paper or electronic devices by which members can indicate their choices without revealing how individual members have voted. Okay. Slips of paper or electronic devices. Unless another method is specified by an appropriate rule or motion, a ballot vote is taken on slips of paper. So slips of paper are understood to be sort of the default way of ballot voting. But again, let me just go back. It's taken by some instruments, such as slips of paper or electronic devices, that allows for secrecy. Okay. So the 12th edition provides that the use of electronic devices, such as keypads, to fulfill a ballot requirement in the bylaws can be directed by a special rule of order or convention standing rule, or for a particular vote by a motion relating to methods of voting in the polls. What this means in practice is that when you walk into a convention and there are hundreds of people, you can right there put into your convention standing rule something that says, oh, we're going to use the electronic keypads. It's not a violation of your bylaws to do that. The key is that you have to make sure the method allows the voters to vote secretly, and if it's used in an election, you have to have some provision made for write-in votes. So the answer to the scenario is actually yes. The Briarcliff Theosophical Society can authorize the ballot voting for officers be conducted by keypads so long as members can use them to vote secretly and provision is made for write-in votes. When the election is pending, a motion to conduct the vote by keypads can be adopted by majority vote. So again, that's a recognition that occurred in the recent edition of a change practice related to changes in technology. So okay, if you want an explanation, we'll say that's General Robert didn't say that, but he would have if he'd lived long enough to see this. Penelope? You're muted.
Yeah. I'm curious about the provision made for write-in votes. I understand why it's here in this answer.
Yeah.
I'm completely unaware of any and it may be ignorance, but I'm completely unaware of any electronic keypad, including the ones used by our distinguished Toastmasters International, who just had a convention for write-in votes.
Sure.
Has that issue been raised or addressed? Or you obviously feel that it's extraordinarily important, and now I can see why it's in these words. I just wondered your comments on it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think we should dig into this a little bit. So, the whole idea of adopting a rule that says that election is by ballot vote is we want to make sure that you can designate who you think should be president, let's say, without disclosing it to anyone. And that extends even to the issue of nomination, in that if two people have been nominated and you really don't want either one of them, you think a third person is, you shouldn't be forced to stand up in front of everybody and say, I nominate Chauncey Throckmorton. You can keep your support secret and write his name on the ballot, even though he wasn't one of the two nominated people. So now your question is a technical one. How do you do that with a keypad? Well, first off, there may be keypads that actually have, alphabetic characters on them or something like that. Also, I suspect that people probably have developed, certainly should develop, apps that you can put on a phone. Because certainly if you have a cell phone, it should be possible to mimic all these attributes of a keypad and also be able to type in with a virtual keyboard. Alternatively, what I have seen organizations do, and the National Association of Parliamentarians does this, is they set up the voting so that it's sort of press 1 if you want John, press 2 if you want Mary, and if you want a write-in person, press 3. And if there are enough people who are interested in voting for write-in candidates, that it could potentially affect the outcome of the election, then you actually hand out paper ballots and do everything on paper so that people can write that in. I'm realizing now I probably should have been. I'm assuming people are familiar with these keypads. They may not be. Typically, the keypads operate so that I don't know anything about the technology, but there's some radio frequency or whatever. There's some kind of mothership that's collecting all the data from the keypad. So 400 of us cast our votes, and instantaneously the results have been tabulated and projected on a screen, and they say, it's 150 for John, it's 100 for Mary, 20 people expressed interest in write-in votes, and whatever, it's just there. So then again, that's the system. If there's some button that you press that indicates an interest in a write-in vote, and if there are enough people who are interested in doing a write-in vote, then you switch off of the keypads to paper where you can actually write those names in. My guess is a lot of people just don't do that. Penelope?
I see that Atul has put in the chat that there are several electronic systems that can handle write-ins. For example, the system that NAP and AIP use. So that's interesting.
I didn't know that. I wasn't at the most recent convention. Atul is going to have to explain that to me at some point.
Hi, Daniel.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thanks. Just quickly,
Good to see you.
what NAP and AIP used, I'll give the name. It's called Election Buddy. And it's an electronic system that people accessed either from their computer or from their smartphone. And it had provisions where you chose one of the nominees or you could fill in write-ins. And both organizations used it this year in their annual meetings.
So you didn't use like a pre-made keypads. You used your own cell phones probably.
Yeah, it was what we're calling BYOD, bring your own device.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And again, you can, if your bylaws specify that election of officers is conducted by ballot, you can absolutely go ahead and nevertheless either adopt by majority vote a motion to conduct a particular ballot vote using this electronic devices, or you could do some sort of a special rule of order for the entire. That would take notice. You could do a convention standing rule or something like that. Penelope?
So it sounds like there might be in the next edition changes in the word that says keypads.
Maybe so. If you look at the electronic voting section of editions, going back some years, they keep referring to, I think what it is. It's like these standalone electronic. People used to get like voting machines, like they sometimes set up at your local school when you do voting, and there were a lot of references to those. So actually, the language has changed a lot this time around to make it a little bit fresher, but it's probably going to have to be changed again when we get rid of all the fax references. Okay, shall I move on? A couple more scenarios I just wanted to mention. Instructions to committees. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. Just again, by way of background, at the time an assembly refers a matter to a committee, it can and probably should provide instructions to the committee on matters such as when to meet, how to conduct business, whether to employ an expert consultant, and most importantly, when to report. This is not, I'm giving you the reference in the book. This is not in quote marks. I wrote this, and so with that word "should," there is a bit of editorializing on my part. This is the point I try to make very frequently, that if you've ever been in that frustrating situation of referring a matter to a committee, and then the committee, you never hear from them again, it's a good idea to tell them exactly what they're supposed to do, exactly how they're supposed to do it, and exactly when they're supposed to report back to you. Additional instructions to a committee can also be given at a later time after you referred the matter to them and before they report it. So the question I asked you to think about at the beginning was, hey, the special committee that was appointed to plan the annual member luncheon has not been able to meet. They just can't all get to the same place at the same time. And the time for making its recommendation is approaching. To expedite the committee's work, a member moves that the committee be instructed to meet by telephone. Is this motion in order? Or by Zoom? I think I said by Zoom earlier. That would make more sense. And is this motion in order? And if so, what vote is required to adopt it? I think most people would assume it probably is in order, although there's a certain squeamishness. I mean, what if the bylaws don't say anything about whether or not they can meet electronically? Is that an issue? And also then there's this question that arises, is what's the vote needed to instruct them to do this? This seems to have something to do with procedure, and many of you probably realize that when we suspend rules of order, it usually takes a 2/3 vote. Well, in fact, the answer is yes. Provided the committee is not expressly established in the bylaws, the committee can be directed by its parent assembly to meet electronically, so by phone, by Zoom. A motion to instruct a committee to meet electronically is an incidental main motion requiring a majority vote to adopt. Some more attention was made to this in the 12th edition because it was a point of confusion. When we, the assembly of the society, the membership, suspend one of our own rules of order, assuming that it's a suspendable rule, it will typically take a 2/3 vote to do that suspension. When we tell the committee what to do, we're not suspending one of our rules, we're just giving an order to a subordinate. It's just like giving an order to the president or giving an order to the treasurer. We're ordering that committee to conduct its meetings by Zoom. And you can adopt a motion to order a committee to do that by majority vote. The final of the scenarios is dealt with point of order. This is another topic that's very interesting to me. This is one that doesn't deal with technology in any way. Many of you may realize generally a point of order must be raised at the time a breach occurs. So if you want to, raise a point of order that the motion needs a second and no one seconded it, you need to do it right at the moment it first comes up, not after 5 minutes of debate. But certain actions create what we call a continuing breach, in which case a point of order can be made at any time during the continuance of the breach. That is, at any time that the action has continuing force and effect, regardless of how much time has elapsed. What do I mean by that? Okay. You adopt a main motion and it conflicts with the bylaws. No one noticed it at the time, but even after months or in principle, years have gone by, you can still raise the fact that the main motion that was adopted conflicts with the bylaws. If that main motion is still in effect, you can raise it, the point of order, and the chair should rule that the point of order is well taken and that the main motion is null and void. Similarly, we've been talking about ballot votes. Very common for bylaws to say that elections must be conducted by ballot vote. Well, if your bylaws say the election must be conducted by ballot vote and someone goes out and elects by voice vote, that creates a continuing breach. That election has to be held again. Or if a member is improperly denied his or her right to vote, and particularly if that ends up affecting the outcome of the vote, the point of order can have a motion declared null and void. So the question I asked you to think about was, at a membership meeting, the assembly defeats a motion that the society endorsed Senator Throckmorton for re-election. The following week, the executive board adopts the same motion that the society endorsed Senator Throckmorton for re-election. Now, I want to pause here and make this a little clearer because it may not be clear enough what I've written here. I'm assuming that in both cases, I mean, it is written here, it's the society that's doing the endorsing. So in one case, it's the membership that says the society does the endorsing. And in the other case, it's the board that says the society does the endorsing. It's not the board saying the board is endorsing. Question is, two questions really. Is the board's action proper? And if not, what action can the membership take in response? Some changes on this particular issue were made to both the 11th and the 12th edition by the authorship. In the 11th edition, we wanted to address confusion related to whether or not the board could even adopt this motion, because a lot of people said, well, certainly if the assembly adopts a motion, the board can't do something contrary to that. But if the assembly defeats the motion, well, a lot of parliamentarians told us, it hasn't really done anything. They defeated the motion. They haven't really done anything. The board can just go ahead and do it anyway. And the 11th edition was modified to say, heck no. If the assembly defeats a motion to endorse Senator Throckmorton on Tuesday, the board can certainly not turn around on Wednesday and adopt that same motion. It doesn't actually say heck no in the book, but it kind of does if you read between the lines. A board may never alter a decision of the society's assembly, even by a motion to rescind or amend something previously adopted, or by adoption of a proposal which has been rejected, unless the bylaws say so. That's the ultimate trump card. So that was added in the 11th edition, but the 12th edition goes further and actually provides remedies. It says that if a board takes action that exceeds the board's authority or conflicts with the decision of the assembly or falls under any of various categories of continuing breaches, there are clearly stated remedies. First off, a point of order can be raised at a board meeting during continuance of the breach. So hopefully the board realizes itself that it's screwed up. But if it doesn't, then the membership can adopt a motion by majority vote simply declaring that the board's action is null and void. And if the breach is affecting business at a meeting of the assembly, the action can be declared null and void by a ruling of the chair. So all of this was added in with the 12th edition to provide more guidance in these cases in this sort of continuing conflict between boards and assemblies. So that was sort of my peek at Robert's Rules of Order newly revised from these perspectives, the perspective of the user seeking a parliamentary authority, from the perspective of the family that works very hard to maintain the legacy of its ancestor, General Robert, and from the perspective of the authorship team trying to make these changes. I was flipping through my notes, before coming here. I came to my bedroom. I'm sitting in my room. That's where I came. Before coming to this meeting and logging in, I was flipping through my notes, and I was thinking about the this book that has lasted now for nearly a century and a half, and I guess my mind took me back to a quotation from Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye was a famous Canadian literary scholar. Atul gives a smile about the Canadian. Northrop Frye was a very famous literary scholar, and he, in a wonderful little book that he wrote some years ago, he was talking about the Latin poet, the Roman poet Horace, the famous odist. And he said Horace, in a particularly boastful mood, once said his verse would last as long as the Vestal virgins kept going up the Capitoline Hill to worship at the temple of Jupiter. But Horace's poetry actually lasted longer than the entire religion of Jupiter. And Jupiter himself has only survived because he disappeared into literature. And it got me to thinking, Horace thought he was boasting, and in fact, the truth was much more than that. And I wonder, this book, this little piece of literature that General Robert wrote, could he have had any idea that it would still be attracting this much attention a century and a half later? And then I finally came to the question of his two great monumental achievements, Robert's Rules of Order and the Galveston seawall. Which do you think will stand the longest? So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I am in charge of the Q&A session here, so I'm going to take over from our Toastmaster for just a moment and see if there are questions that people have. I'm going to switch to a gallery view so I can see hands as well as chats. Atul, I see you first up there.
I do believe I see Jan Paul had his physical hand up before my virtual one, so I'll yield to Jan Paul.
Thank you so much. Jan Paul, your question. You're muted though.
A very interesting, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. A very interesting presentation. I love the structure. I want to go back to point 0, which I thought was missing. Why the interest in this field? As a mathematician, you could have had many other hobbies.
Well, I didn't say I didn't have other hobbies, but no, I actually, I came into this a very weird route, and I'll try to tell the story briefly. I was, as I'd like to say, I was minding my own business. I was a junior faculty member at Hofstra University on Long Island. I'm still at Hofstra, and I was just going in for lunch one day, and a senior colleague in my department came up to me and said, "Hey, Dan, I think you'll get a kick out of this because you're a logician. We need a parliamentarian. Would you be willing to run for election as parliamentarian?" Now, there's something terribly wrong in that sentence, which is, you don't just randomly pick someone who might get a kick out of it and then have them run, for election as parliamentarian. You pick someone who knows what the heck they were doing. But I was a junior faculty member. I was untenured, and I said, "Okay, Bob." And then I said, "So, who am I running against? How many candidates are there?" And he said, "Oh, no. If we can get even one person to run, we're happy with that." And so, as I like to say, I ran unopposed and won an upset victory. But I still knew nothing about it. And then I went into that fabled meeting. Thank goodness it was nothing like General Roberts' meeting, and thank goodness I wasn't presiding. But there was a very contentious issue before the faculty. I'll tell you what it was. It actually had to do with the presence of an ROTC chapter on our campus vis-a-vis the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy and our own policies regarding gay students and so on and so forth. Well, I mean, people want to talk about rescissions. People are saying, well, what's the vote needed for this, that? I'm just sitting there flipping through my copy of, Webster's Simplified Guide to Robert's Rules. And I thought, well, I got to learn some of this. So at any rate, I started going online and learning from the Robert's Rules Forum. And that brought me to the attention of Mr. Hunneman, who is the one who actually invited me to give that talk that I mentioned to you at the seminar in Baltimore that led to this. But that was it. I was just, as I say, minding my own business.
Thank you. And Jan Paul, that's a great question to have asked. And let's see, Atul, now I believe it is to you.
Thank you. And I'm very sorry that I got my timings mixed up. So I will reinforce the question in the chat about how to access the recording. But what I did hear, Daniel, you talked about the instructions to a committee, and you used the example of meeting electronically and an incidental main motion requiring a majority. I'm in a situation where it's not a committee, but the executive board of the association. And whether that would still be a majority or whether that would require a 2/3 vote because a board's
Executive
nature
board
is
of the
being different.
organization?
Yes.
No, it shouldn't change. I mean, again, I mean, obviously, everything is subject to your bylaws, but generally speaking, the understanding of the relationship between the membership and an executive board under Robert's Rules of Order newly revised is that the executive board is, at least by default, subordinate. So if you want to give instructions to the board, you should be able to do so on the same basis in which you give instructions to a committee, including instructing it to meet by Zoom, for example.
This example was that the membership wanted to require the board to have every vote by roll call. I don't know if that changes the situation.
That's obnoxious. Yeah.
Fractious.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. And the purpose of a roll call vote is to put each voting person on the record, and then, of course, the membership can demand to see that record. Of course, a board is small, so you can have a roll call vote for a board. I just want to sneak something in here, which is, if anybody ever calls for a roll call vote and you've got 400 people in the room, you should probably just rule it out of order as dilatory. But if someone really is convinced that they want a large body voting by roll call vote, the other thing you can do is order a signed ballot, which is a little bit faster. But yeah, no, I mean, that's imposing a particular procedural rule on the board, but I would say that would be by majority vote. Now, if the board itself has the authority to make that its rule, it would require a 2/3 vote there, certainly, because it's the rule of law. Well, no, a majority vote on a particular motion. But if they were actually adopting a special rule of order, it would certainly require a 2/3 vote and previous notice of the board would do it.
Sorry, you're saying the board would require 2/3 and previous notice, but
Right.
not the membership meeting. Okay.
Correct. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay. Eva, I see you next.
Yes, going along with the voting, I was just kind of curious because Penelope was going to take two positions. She was going to be the president and the treasurer. So it was an option that the assembly could vote for Penelope for both positions. But once she's taken the position of president, when it comes down to the treasurer, would that be open to the assembly for additional nominations? Or
Sure.
or would it be closed? Would that session be closed? And if there's two candidates for the secretary's position, treasurer's position, I should say, then the highest vote would go. How does that work?
Well, first off, if it's a ballot vote, of course, people can vote for unnominated candidates. They can write them in, but you could certainly reopen. I think in the circumstance I'm describing, I don't think that nominations, I'd have to think about it a little bit. I don't think nominations would sort of automatically be reopened at that point. However, there could be a motion to reopen nominations.
So then if it wasn't reopened and Penelope had the highest amount for the treasurer, she would become the treasurer as well. Is that how it would work?
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm understanding correctly, she was initially elected president and treasurer by by two votes that took place on a single ballot. She selected to be president, and then a new election was held for the treasurer. If you guys, for whatever reason, decide you want to elect her as treasurer, again, you really want that. In other words, you knowingly cast your votes for her as treasurer, being aware of the fact that she's already serving as your president. If you do that, then unless your bylaws expressly prohibit it, she is elected to treasurer and now serves in two positions.
Okay, so the question is, it's not automatic. It is open up for a vote again for the treasurer at that time. So anyone can make an additional change if they want to change their mind, or
oh yeah,
Okay.
it's a new election. I mean, The old ballots are gone. You're starting fresh.
Okay, thank you. That clears it up. That's good. Thank you. Sorry, Penelope. You only have one. You're only the president. I don't. What
Well,
can we do?
I might have withdrawn my nomination for treasurer too.
Okay, thank you.
So let me just see hand, and let's ask some of our. Let me just go around just to make sure that no one's simply being shy about asking questions. Tom, did you have anything that you wanted to ask?
Well, I know, and I think parliamentary procedures, there's like a tab system that you can add to your book that makes it easier to get around and move it. Have you ever used that? Would you recommend that? I know you can only get it from one place, or is it just it's a tabbing thing you add to your book, and you're familiar with it at all?
I've seen people who have that, and I don't have it. Are those tabs sold by the NAP? Maybe.
Right, they are.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm terrible. You know, when with the 10th edition, I was so good. Like you could ask me, you could give me a quote, and I could like in 10 seconds find it in the book. But what has happened is over the last publication of the last two editions, the 11th and the 12th, I'm now working with the electronic files. I mean, it would be more delightful to imagine that, you know, the amanuensis sits beside the authorship team with her feathered quill and, you know, writes it all down. But in fact, we're just working with a Microsoft Word document, you know. And so what I find is terribly frustrating is I find it difficult to locate things in the book because I don't physically have the book in my hand that much. Now I'm just like, you know, typing in a, you know, Control F and searching for something in the Word document. So probably I need to buy those tabs at some point. I can't really advise you on how they work.
I mean, does anybody in this group ever use the tabs from the PI parliament? Oh, Phyllis, would you recommend them?
For me, I'm brand new, so just learning the book, it makes it easier for me to find anything I'm looking through, flip through. It's great for me, but it's personal choice.
Got
But
it.
I'm brand new, so don't go by me.
Phyllis, do you have any brand new questions or comments?
No, but I do like the fact that when someone brought up about, you know, we did do the electronic, we did voting at the NAP convention. So Will Roberts and they were there. I can't remember the older guy, the main guy. He spoke about whatever, blah, blah, blah. But I guess the great granddaughter and the great, you know, I got them, you know, they were in my class and I talked with them, blah, blah. And they said the whole thing. So yes, it is a conglomerate, you know, and this is, you know, keep it in the family, but and how they're branching out, you know, not with the tabs that I have, and you got the thumb drives and you got the CDs and all that. So it makes it easy. And that's great for me but I got the book anyway, because now I'm back to old school. Get the book in your hand and flip through whatever. Yes. And the other thing that the presenter, Mr. Daniel, said is that he gave me history. I never thought about looking up the history of how this all became about and whatever. So I was really, I'm old now, so I got into the history. So I have to go back and read his history of how it all became about and all that. But so I thought that was good. But it is interesting whether or not they're going to change the book on a few things that came out from the NAP. Yeah, that will, because we're launching and even with the what is it, the IA, you know, we're launching into that world too as well. So there's something to think about. We'll see. Time will tell.
Thank you, Phyllis. Let's see if we can move here. Samantha, any comments or questions?
I would just like to say how I thoroughly enjoyed this hour and 30 minutes. It was very insightful. Thank you.
Okay. Dunstan-Nett.
Thanks, Penelope. I don't have any questions, but I listened carefully. I've enjoyed the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And so many questions I had before were answered
Mhm.
by his presentation, because I was reading the 12th edition, especially as concerned virtual meetings online, which I found it at that time a little difficult to understand or to put into practice. And now what he explained about the voting of the same person for two positions was clarified, and I took notes on that. This is very, very useful for the district, because these are problems that come up during meetings, Toastmasters meetings, horizontal, where I also participate, and sometimes you have no one to explain. So this is very self-explanatory, and I will upload it and use it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dustin. Myra, any quick comments or questions?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. I'll just lower my hand. I really like the fact on how you provided the overview for using the book, breaking it down into chapters, that how we should use that. I found that very helpful. My question is, you mentioned how that one of the fears of his mother was him meeting one of her brothers on the battlefield. How many brothers did she have again?
I have it in my head, but I don't know if this is right. That it would have been her brothers and her husband's brothers both, that he had 14 uncles. But that just sounds implausible. Maybe it's not that high, but that's the number that I remember seeing somewhere. This is fresh in my mind. I read or rather listened to on tape, and I would recommend to anybody. I read this amazing biography of Teddy Roosevelt, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, which won the Pulitzer Prize some years ago by Edmund Morris. And there was a similar situation in his family. Teddy Roosevelt's mother was from the South. His father was from the North. So it was terrifying to her that her husband was going to go to war and be on, the opposite side of the field from one of her brothers.
They usually
Ultimately,
have very large families from the South.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Theodore Roosevelt Sr. paid someone to take his place.
And thank you for visiting us again, Myra. I believe we've seen you before.
Oh, definitely.
So please do come back. Let me see. We've had just a couple more minutes. Jocelyn, welcome. I don't believe we've had the pleasure of having you join us before. Do you have any comments or quick questions here?
I don't have any questions. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I was really interesting to hear the history that was presented. That was fascinating. Glad that I was able to attend.
Terrific. We hope to see you again. Wilbur, nice to see you this evening. Any quick questions?
Glad to be here. Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
Okay. Guinevere, any questions, comments? It's your first time at our meeting, I believe.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was very educational presentation. My extent of Robert's Rules of Orders was watching like the Senate hearings or that type of setting and listening to some of the discourse and then how they would vote on certain things. And being a part of a club now, a Toastmasters club that actually does work with Robert's Rules of Orders, I went to a simplified version online to sort of read about it and try to catch up on some of the, aspects of Robert's Rules of Orders and how we use it at the club. But this has been truly an educational session. I had no idea that it was this vast. So I'm really appreciative of the invitation. Thank you so much, Penelope.
Thank you. Eldra, any comments or questions? We're glad to have you visiting us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I just wanted to say I'm at the point now where I really want to take the test to be RPR, a registered parliamentarian, but the test has changed, and with the new requirements for education, I didn't know whether this would count toward that or not.
You're out of my depth on that one. I don't know if anybody has, I don't believe it's not registered. As the only form that I went to, it said that that the program had to be registered in advance and approved, is my understanding. Tan, I think you're commenting, Phyllis is also shaking her head no.
No,
Yeah.
correct. You are correct.
The membership exam, it consists now of 45 questions, and it's also from the Robert Rules of Order in brief. So if you're preparing and studying that, who was that? Aldra, are you studying? Oh, you studying for the membership or for the RP?
For the RP.
Okay, sure. Yeah, it is. It is different, but Artur, you have something to add?
I believe with your permission, Penelope, I believe that the idea of education points only applies after you get your RP, and you have to get so many education credits. And I'm sure this session should qualify, but it would require someone from this group to contact NAP and get these sessions approved.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. Dr. Faye Ryson, any comments or questions?
Yes, I would just say I appreciate Wilbert telling me about this forum, and I found it very interesting. I hope that I can attend the sessions to come.
Great, that's terrific. So Wilbur has your contact information. We'll be sure you're on our list.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I've missed a couple of our members quickly here. Andrea, any comments? And Dana, I'll come to you next if you're going to want. So Andrea, anything? Okay, Corliss, any comments? And then I'll go to Dana if he wants to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I enjoyed, as always, the presentations. I especially enjoyed your history of Mr. Roberts. I was president of the Georgia unit in 2013. And Mr. Roberts, Maurice Henderson, and Bert came to Atlanta. And the things that were on his bucket list was one, to visit Morehouse College. And we did do that. He addressed some of the students there at Morehouse College. And there is a section in Morehouse College called Roberts Hall that's named after Joseph. He did come to my meeting, which I'm still reeling from. It was the annual meeting. And but he was very kind and very gentle, and I appreciate it. It was just an experience that I will never forget.
Lovely.
Terrific. Thank you. I don't see any waving hands frantically going. I'll turn this back to our Toastmaster for the evening, Tom.
Thank you, Penelope, for leading the discussion, and thank us again for our speaker, Dr. Daniel Seabold. We appreciate it, and I think we all learned a lot. Thank you very much. With that, oh wait, Wilbur just raised his hand.
And
yes, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to address the group and say that I was one of the delegates to the NAP National Convention held in Atlanta this past weekend. It was marvelous, and I want to say hats off to one of our virtual parliamentarians who was one of the coordinators, and that's our state president here in Georgia, Corliss Baker. So if everyone would please give her a round of applause for the hard work that they did. And I also am very happy that the NAP was held in Atlanta. I was able to come, and I have met a wonderful parliamentary friend in Dr. Faye Rice, and happy to have her on the call today. So she mentioned that I invited her, but I do hope that she'll become a part of our virtual parliamentarians Toastmasters in addition to attending the study sessions. And it was wonderful meeting Tan in person finally, and I was able to meet the great-great-granddaughter and the great-great-great-granddaughter of Henry Martin Roberts at General Robert at the convention, and had time to speak with them, and they're excited and getting involved with the NAP. So I just wanted to mention that to our group here, and I hope that I get to meet many of the other members in person, and that I don't know, maybe one of the other ones can give the details, but start planning the training conference will be held in maybe something. There's a training conference coming up. It was in Albuquerque last time, so now it's the next one I think is going to be in San Antonio, Texas. So everyone should start planning for that, and hopefully we might be able to have an in-person meeting at one of those meetings of the virtual parliamentarians. Who knows? So that's my input, and thank you for giving me a moment.
All right, thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our president, Tan Johnson. Tan, take it away.
Thank you. Dana, you didn't get a chance to speak. I don't know whether you had a few words that you wanted to say as well. I know Penelope had called on you.
Thank you. I have nothing to say.
Okay, Dan. Just didn't want to overlook anyone. Dr. Seabold, it was great to hear your presentation. As someone said something about your as a math instructor, your history. I was all the while I was thinking, reminding me of all the history class I was taking at college and all the notes that I was taking. But it was just a great presentation about the history, about the background, to get us where we are today and how come we are studying all of this Robert Rules of Order. So I really appreciate all of the history. So, although you're a math teacher, I think you got a hidden history buff back there as well. So really appreciate that. Really appreciate all the guests who are attending tonight. Like Wilbur said, good to have met everyone in person at the NAP conference this past weekend. Again, Corley did a fabulous job. And for everyone, I want you to mark your calendars for Wednesday, October 4th. For our regular virtual parliamentarian meeting. It starts at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So we want all our guests and our members to come back to join us for our regular monthly meeting, as well as mark your calendars for the third Sunday in October for the next Sunday forum. We have a great lineup. Penelope have got a great lineup for us for the next several months. So we want you to come back. So again, welcome. And that's all I have to say. Great presentation. And thank you everyone for coming. Penelope, you're on mute. Are you talking to us?
No, just smiling very happily.
Okay, sure.